A wrapped bundle of 3 cigars lay forgotten in a Maryland fence corner on September 13, 1862, and the Confederacy won its independence because no Union soldier ever picked it up. The paper around those cigars was a clean copy of Special Order 191, Robert E. Lee's blueprint for dividing the Army of Northern Virginia into 4 columns across western Maryland. In the history we know, Corporal Barton Mitchell of the 27th Indiana stumbled across that bundle in a field outside Frederick and handed it up the chain to George McClellan, who suddenly held in his hand the position and intent of every Confederate column. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Here, the 27th Indiana bivouacs on a different patch of ground a quarter-mile to the east. The cigars stay where D.H. Hill's staff officer dropped them, and McClellan, marching west toward Frederick on September 13th, advances into a fog he never recognizes as fog. What no one in Washington knew at that moment, what would not become clear for another 2 weeks, was that the war's outcome had already been decided by a campsite chosen at random. Lee had crossed the Potomac on September 4, 1862, with roughly 40,000 effectives, an army weakened by straggling, by hunger, and by men marching barefoot through the limestone country of the Cumberland Valley. Special Order 191, issued on September 9th, sent Stonewall Jackson south to seize Harper's Ferry and its garrison of 12,000 Federals, while Longstreet, D.H. Hill, and the trains held the line through Boonesboro and Hagerstown. It was an audacious dispersal, and Lee's audacity rested on a single assumption that McClellan would move, as he always moved, slowly. In the actual war, the lost order shattered that assumption and forced Lee to fight at Antietam on terrain not of his choosing. Here, the assumption holds. On September 14th and 15, with Jackson tightening his ring around Harper's Ferry, Lee quietly orders Longstreet to draw in toward Hagerstown rather than scatter further north toward Pennsylvania. Jeb Stuart's cavalry screens the passes of South Mountain Turners, Foxes, Cramptons masking every road. From McClellan's headquarters at Frederick, the Army of Northern Virginia appears to be a single mass somewhere beyond the ridge, exact location unknown, exact strength as always overestimated. On the morning of September 14th, McClellan pushes Jesse Reno's 9th Corps up the National Road toward Turner's Gap, expecting nothing more than a rearguard skirmish. What waits for him is something else. Longstreet, marching east from Hagerstown through the night, debouches from the Cumberland Valley onto the Federal right flank north of the road. The blow falls on troops still in column before brigades can deploy. Hooker's I Corps, hurrying up to support Reno, is caught in the woods above the gap and shoved back across the open farmland toward Middletown. By mid-afternoon, the Federal advance has stalled, then bent, then begun to fold. Word reaches Lee at Boonesboro that Harper's Ferry has surrendered that very morning, 12,000 prisoners, 70 guns, and Jackson's foot cavalry now free to march. Jackson drives his men north through the day on roads choked with summer dust. By dusk, his lead division strikes the southern shoulder of the Federal position. The line breaks before full dark. McClellan, watching from a hill near Middletown, sees what he has long imagined and never seen, a Confederate army of, in his telling, 100,000 men closing on his flanks. He gives the order to disengage. The Army of the Potomac falls back through Frederick on the night of September 14th, abandoning the town it had marched into only days before. Behind the rearguard, surgeons leave the worst of the wounded in churches and private homes. By September 16th, McClellan has crossed the Monocacy and is moving toward the Washington defenses, his command intact but stunned, regiments shaken and corps commanders quarreling over who broke first. In Washington, Lincoln receives the dispatches in the small hours and walks the second-floor corridor of the Executive Mansion alone. The garrisons at Fort Stevens, Reno, and Lincoln are doubled. Edwin Stanton orders the gunboats up the Potomac. Lee, for his part, does not press toward the capital. He has done what he came to do. He has won a battle on northern soil. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, drafted in July and waiting in Lincoln's desk for a victory to give it weight, stays in the desk. There will be no victory to release it. The news reaches London by the second week of October. Lord Palmerston had been writing to Foreign Secretary Russell since mid-September about the wisdom of mediation. The South Mountain dispatches turned that correspondence into policy. On October 13th, the cabinet meets at Downing Street and reaches what Russell calls a settled view. Southern independence is now a fact on the ground, and Britain's role is to acknowledge it before further blood is spilled. In Paris, Napoleon III, already committed to his Mexican adventure under Maximilian, instructs Foreign Minister Drouin de Lhuys to coordinate a joint approach with the British. James Mason in London and John Slidell in Paris, who have spent a year in antechambers, are at last received in drawing rooms. The cotton mills of Lancashire are quiet. The Erlanger House in Paris is preparing a new tranche of Confederate bonds. None of this is yet a treaty. None of it is yet recognition. But the conversations have shifted from whether to when, and the men who matter in two capitals have already answered the second question in their private minds. The American voter answers in November, without an Emancipation Proclamation to rally abolitionist sentiment, without a battlefield victory to anchor confidence in the war's progress. The Democratic argument writes itself: the war has produced defeat in Maryland, hesitation in Washington, and no end in sight. Horatio Seymour wins the New York governorship by a wider margin than anyone predicts. Democrats take more than 30 seats in the House. Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana legislatures swing toward what the newspapers call the peace interest. Lincoln retains the executive. His term has 3 more years, but his working majority for prosecuting the war has thinned to a knife's edge. Thaddeus Stevens writes privately that the country is being asked, in effect, whether it still wishes to be one country, and that the answer he hears in the returns is not the one he wants. On December 23, 1862, the British government formally recognizes the Confederate States of America as a sovereign nation. France follows on December 30. The language in both notes is careful. This is recognition of a government in being, not an alliance, not a guarantee, and explicitly not a challenge to the federal blockade, which both powers continue to honor in principle. Jefferson Davis receives the British dispatch in Richmond on Christmas Eve and orders no celebration. Lee, in winter quarters near Winchester, reads it and writes to his wife that the work of arms is not finished. In London, Charles Francis Adams, the United States minister, requests his passports. The request is declined, and a diplomatic understanding of cool civility takes its place. The shape of the war has not changed by a single rifle. The shape of the world around the war has changed entirely. Through the winter of 1863, Lincoln explores armistice terms through intermediaries: Thurlow Weed in New York, Charles Sumner with the Massachusetts delegation, quiet emissaries to Richmond by way of Norfolk. He insists on 3 things: no European garrisons on the continent, no expansion of slavery into the territories, and the integrity of the border states. The blockade tightens around Charleston and Mobile, but European-flagged shipping into Matamoros on the Mexican coast and into Nassau in the Bahamas swells through the spring, and Confederate cotton begins to move again across the Atlantic in volumes the Treasury in Richmond can almost believe. The federal government settles into the long work of being a smaller country. The Confederate government settles into the longer and stranger work of being a recognized one. Slavery, undisturbed by proclamation, persists in the new nation's constitution and on its plantations, and the moral question that the war was beginning to answer is left, instead, to a generation not yet born. And somewhere in a Maryland fence corner, by then long since plowed under, 3 cigars had once been wrapped in a piece of paper that no one ever read.